Madam Speaker, in January 2012, I asked the Prime Minister to apologize for the government's characterization of First Nations as adversaries in an internal government document on the oil sands. My question was, will the Prime Minister publicly apologize for this shameful position and affirm that First Nations have constitutional rights that must be recognized and respected when it comes to the development of anything on or affecting their traditional lands? Last January, Greenpeace Canada and Climate Action Network released an internal government document entitled Pan-European Oil Sands Advocacy Strategy, which contained a list that divided stakeholders according to their position on the oil sands as influencers, allies, or adversaries. First Nations were appalled when they discovered that the government had labeled them as adversaries, along with environmental advocates. I would like to remind the House that when I asked this question on January 31st, the Crown First Nations gathering had just been held. At the gathering, the Prime Minister declared that the time had come to reset the relationship between Crown and First Nations. But the gap between the Prime Minister's rhetoric on resetting the relationship and the reality of his government's total disregard for the rights of Indigenous people to be fully recognized and respected when it comes to resource development is staggering. Let's not forget that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada has endorsed, obliges Canada to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous people. Adversaries, I cannot think of a more insulting term. But I would remind the House that this characterization is entirely consistent with the Conservatives' default position on dealing with those who hold different views, that you are either with the government or against it. It's equally disturbing that this same document characterizes the Federal Aboriginal Affairs Department as well as the National Energy Board, which is supposed to be an independent industry regulator, as allies. For anyone who values the independence and impartiality of democratic processes like the NEB hearings, this characterization raises alarm bells about the independence and impartiality of the hearings and leaves little doubt that the government has already determined the outcome of the review. The document goes on to justify the government's defense of the oil sands industry in terms of the creation of jobs and economic prosperity for all Canadians. But I would ask an important question. What are the potential risks to First Nations who are along the pipeline route? I have heard from groups like the Yinka Dene Alliance who oppose the Northern Gateway Pipeline, not because they are against development, but because they believe this project could be potentially catastrophic. An oil spill in their traditional territories would not just be an environmental nightmare, but would jeopardize jobs that exist today for First Nations in the vibrant tourism and fisheries sectors. Once again, opposition to the Gateway Pipeline should not be misconstrued as opposition to development writ large. In the case of the Yinka Dene, these First Nations are partners in a project to explore liquid natural gas from a new terminal in Kitimat, a project that they determined carries low risks to both the economy and the environment. For the sake of clarity, I want to ask the Parliamentary Secretary today if he is willing to clarify the government's position. Is the position of the government to treat the constitutional rights of First Nations with the type of disrespect shown in that internal memo?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I am pleased to answer the question of the member for St. Paul. I would like to assure the member that the Government of Canada pledges to protect the health and security of Aboriginal communities and the environmental integrity of lands on reserve. Canada has a legal obligation to consult and accommodate Aboriginal groups in certain situations, and our government takes its obligation to consult seriously, and it will consult Aboriginal groups when an activity proposed by the federal government could have negative impacts on treaty or ancestral rights. Aboriginal consultation is a key element of the environmental assessment process and regulatory process in Canada. Canada's approach includes new updated guidelines for federal public servants to respect the obligation to consult and directives on consultation. These principles and directives provide clearer guidelines and to federal public servants with regard to their obligation to consult. Currently, we are working with Aboriginal groups, provinces, and territories to develop a process that is based on collaboration for consultation and accommodation, a process that will lead to an efficient decision-making process and the elimination of duplication and overlapping with other administrations. I would also like to add that Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development Canada advocates a consensual approach to work with other departments to ensure that significant consultations are conducted for resource projects and other activities. Canada seeks to fulfill its legal duty to consult by carrying out significant consultations for Aboriginal communities by ensuring that we take into account their opinions when it comes time to take a decision on, for example, the development of oil sands or other things or other activities. These broad-based consultations foster the Canadian economy by advancing these projects. By undertaking significant consultations, we are helping Aboriginal groups to improve their economic prosperity and welfare, establish healthy and more durable communities, and participate more profoundly in Canada's economic development. Madam Speaker, our government continues to work in concert with the governments with the implementation of strategies that will ensure that we make enlightened decisions that meet our current needs and those of future generations. Thank you.
Member for St. Paul's.
Madam Speaker, I don't believe that the parliamentary secretary actually heard the question. It is the position of the government to treat the constitutional rights of First Nations with the type of disrespect shown in that internal memo? How can we believe that the Conservatives are willing to work in partnership with First Nations when it qualifies them in that very document as adversaries? After the Crown First Nations gathering, after the actually timeliness of the Budget Implementation Act debate today, where the National Chief has been so critical of again, the government doesn't seem to understand in this budget implementation that it's bound by the Constitution to uphold its duty to consult, which means it cannot unilaterally reduce these duties through changes to existing legislation. It is extraordinarily important that the treaties are honored, that government treat the governments of First Nations government to government. And while the parliamentary secretary apologized today for the disgraceful words used by his government to characterize First Nations as adversaries.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.